everyone, and welcome to today's discussion on addressing embodied ecological impacts in construction with life cycle assessment. I'm Asha Ramachandran. I lead global AEC marketing and communications at OneClick LCA. Today, I'm very delighted to be joined by our speakers, Alejandro Alfaro, Project Engineering Project Manager at Geon, Clement Beget, Associate Director at Geon, and James Thornton, Product Owner at OneClick LCA. OneDLC is the world's leading end-to-end sustainability platform for construction and manufacturing. Used in over 170 plus countries, its AI-powered software automates lifecycle assessment and environmental product declarations to decarbonize construction value chain. Learn more at oneclicklca.com. Now over to you, Alejandro.
Hello, I'm Alejandro, Engineering Project Manager at Geon Company. Geon is a consulting and engineering company specialized in sustainable development. We mostly work on real estate projects and we offer a full range of services. We are specialized in environmental certifications, technical studies related to energy and carbon, biodiversity, reuse of materials, research and development, and more. And we also conduct environment impact assessments throughout buildings or products life cycle.
Thank you so much, Alejandro, for introducing Geon. Now over to you, James, to introduce the topic.
Yeah, hi everyone. So quickly about myself, I'm James, product owner at OneClick LCA, primarily working on biodiversity and also circularity as well. And yeah, what we're going to talk about is how construction interacts with nature or biodiversity. And as you can see from this diagram, there's kind of four interactions that are grouped together: impacts and opportunities and dependencies and risk. But nature is very complicated, and these things are very interconnected. But Clement, maybe you can give a short introduction about yourself and talk about the impacts and dependencies on nature first.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I'm Clément Béguin. I work as an associate at Geon Company, and I work also on these biodiversity fields, and notably on biodiversity strategies for our clients. So about the impacts, first of all, we can classify them as direct impacts and indirect impacts also. So firstly, the direct impacts are generated notably during construction phase. We can quote three of them, for example. So the first one is habitat destruction, pollution, and habitat fragmentation, which can isolate populations and make it harder for them to migrate, find mates, or access resources. Secondly, construction can also lead to the destruction of invasive species, which can outcompete native species and disrupt local ecosystems. Thirdly, soil disturbance can caused by construction, as excavation and grading can compact soil and disturb its structure, which negatively impacting soil organisms and reducing vegetation growth. We just saw the direct impacts. Let's see what are the indirect ones. So they are generated by the supply chain and operation phases, which concern both new buildings and renovations, such as the resources and energy consumption, as the construction industry require a vast amount of resources, so for example timber or minerals, often leading to degradation of ecosystem where these resources are extracted. And the extraction and the production of these resources require high energy consumption. So the energy consumption can impact climate changing. Obviously, it depends notably on the type and the quantity of energy content. For example, heating network is often more eco-friendly than fossil fuel systems. But it's just an example. And then the water use and the pollution is also a main issue, as construction activities often impact water bodies through increased runoff or sedimentation and can lead to contamination affecting aquatic habitats and species, which also concerns operation phase. So about the dependencies now, as previously mentioned, construction industry is very dependent on materials and energy related to their production, as construction industry relies heavily on natural resources, and sustainable sourcing is critical for protecting biodiversity. For example, sustainably sourced timber helps to maintain, for example, the forest ecosystems. We can also evoke ecosystem services, as ecosystems provide services such as clean water, clean air, pollination, flood regulation, which the construction industry depends on for long-term viability and community well-being of users. So maybe, James, could you talk more about risks and opportunities?
Yeah, thanks, Clement. So I'll start with risks first. We can kind of categorize risks in three ways primarily. So physical risk is something that physically happens that impacts or could impact business operations. So for example, a flooding a mineral extraction site halts operations. You can also have regulatory risk. So as countries enforce more regulations for climate and biodiversity, this then is a risk to business operations, because you might have increased overhead costs for complying with regulatory requirements. Similarly, you could also have fines in the case of non-compliancy. And thirdly, and maybe the most interesting one, is reputational risk. Consumers especially are becoming more and more educated and more conscious of what they buy. And also from an investment point of view, this is also very critical. And so even if you're not really taking any actions yourself, it can still have a massive risk to your the longevity of your business if consumers find a more sustainable option compared to you. And you can also kind of have different timelines, especially with the physical risk. So you could have an acute or kind of like a one-off risk, like the example I gave previously of a flood impacting a mineral extraction site would be an acute risk. It would happen once and have a massive impact on operations. But similarly, you have chronic risks. So again, as Clement mentioned, we're heavily dependent on resource extraction. So something like sand, which is used a lot in construction, if you're continually extracting too much sand over time, you won't suddenly run out of sand one day, but over time you will extract less and less, and it becomes a chronic problem. And if we take a look at opportunities, these are chances for business to reduce their impacts or reduce their dependency on nature, and also obviously reduce their risk by doing so. So you can have very practical opportunities that kind of are the opposite of what Clement said. You can have direct positive interactions with habitat. So planting more habitats or protecting habitats is a positive interaction. And you can also somehow differentiate your business by reducing your dependency on nature. So prioritizing circular resources would reduce your dependency on continued mineral extraction, as one example. And opportunities are good from a practical business level. They provide resilience and ensure that you'll be able to keep doing what you do for a long time. But especially going back to the reputational side, the opportunities are really important, because investors will prioritize company with good environmental and social performance, because from their point of view, it just means continued returns over a long period of time if your business can keep operating. And similarly, it's well documented in Europe now that consumers are becoming more conscious, and this is kind of what prompted the anti-greenwashing legislation. So if you want to keep selling whatever you're doing, you basically need to start doing this. As I mentioned, one of the risks from the business side is increasing regulations. these are also opportunities as well. So we have regulations that kind of force a business to do something, but then you have these voluntary disclosures and certification schemes that allow businesses to differentiate themselves by providing evidence that they're actually doing more. But Clement, maybe you could start by talking about the regulations that are most affecting your customers.
Thank you, James. So to introduce firstly the European context, globally we can say that until the end of the 90s, the regulation on biodiversity was essentially focused on wildlife, specifically on protection of species and spatial layout. So the awareness of the importance of biodiversity and construction field increased more during the first years of the 21st century. New regulation then framework appeared then in all Europe, such as the European Taxonomy and Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, so CSRD, in Europe. And then post 2020, we had a biodiversity law, such as the framework in UK on the Loi de 2016 in France, so which are complementary to the European context. So the European taxonomy is something. It's a directive. It's classified. It's a classification system that defines criteria for determining if an economic activity is environmentally sustainable or friendly, and it aims to direct investments towards environmentally friendly projects. So it's supposed to contribute to the achievement of the European Union's climate objectives. And it sets notably DNSH, so do not significant harm principles, which states that construction and renovation activities shouldn't cause harm to biodiversity and ecosystems, and taking into account the whole life cycle. So which is a good news, because a lot of regulations are mainly based on on-site protections, on-site measures protection on sites. So the European context also sets rules for companies reporting, including data on environmental impacts, so biodiversity included, and resource use and climate targets too. So the CSRD, which means Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, as I said, concerns European companies that meet two of the three criteria. First, more than 250 employees, 25 million euros balance sheet, and 50 million euros in sales. So if you meet two of the three criteria, you are concerned by this directive. And so this one came into force on January 2024 and requires the companies concerned to report annually on their CSR related information. So it aimed to provide a framework for non-financial reporting at European level. For example, the way in which companies report on how they take into account environmental, social, and governance issues. So biodiversity is a part of these issues. So finally, the CSRD encourages notably real estate players to draw up strategies or at least roadmaps to make better efforts, and notably in biodiversity. So which is a good news for nature. Then more focused on French regulation and BRIM, we can say that the French laws and the certification, if I can put it together, are more precise on the measures, and mainly focused on long-term protection of species on sites. So finally, a bit like the previous law in France, at least. So they aim to prohibit the destruction of protected species, and then to require an ecological diagnosis with measures to improvement. and potentially to implement an ecological management plan, for a few years. So usually it's about 5 years management plan to improve the local potential of biodiversity. So finally, we can say that European regulations offered a new framework to structure initiative going further than just protection on site. And for example, the supply chain can be encouraged to improve these impacts on biodiversity. So then finally, it's companies' actions that push the standard level to respect. So the different companies that are subject to these regulations can implement their strategies, and it make the standard level to respect higher and higher all along the years.
Cool, thanks. I will also just cover UK BNG and also the DGMB part as well. So both of these are site-based. So UK BNG, however, is regulatory, so it came into effect in England, not the whole of the UK. And the principle of UK BNG is that development should leave nature in a better state than before. So this is focused on measuring relative biodiversity value before and after development, and then you have some ratio of how much it's changed. And this affects most new development in the UK, in England, with a few exceptions. But yeah, it's probably the best and most robust site-based assessment, but the limitation is that it's only on the site itself, so it doesn't take into account any kind of supply chain or operational impacts on biodiversity. DGMB is a certification scheme, so voluntary, but very used as like a differentiator to showcase that you're doing more. It's primarily in Germany and Austria. They're used in a few other places as well. It's also site-based, but it's actually limited to like the post-development. So DGMB is essentially based on something called biotope area factor, which was originally developed in Berlin, and it's basically a very simple calculation of the ratio of parts of a site that are beneficial to nature against the whole site. So you get like this quite simple percentage of how good your site is for nature. But again, it's very limited because it doesn't take into account what was there before. So it could still be a net negative, but something that might change in the future. And finally, I'll just touch on the voluntary disclosures because they're all pretty much the same thing, even though there's 4 of them there. They're quite similar to the EU CSRD in that they act as like a framework for a business to basically try and measure and manage all of their impacts, direct, indirect, site, off-site, everything. I would say at the moment the most used is the TNFD, and it seems to be gaining the most traction. And it's the goal of the TNFD is to provide this framework so that with mass adoption it would shift like global financial flows towards nature positive actions rather than nature negative. But yeah, there is some interaction between some of the voluntary disclosures and the CSRD because they kind of work similarly. So you can, if you're doing one, you have some information that can be used in the others. So I think that's why they're becoming quite popular. And I guess one thing that would be interesting to think about at the end as an open question is whether Clément or Alejandro, you see any, or you have any predictions for what regulations might look like in the next few years, or what's kind of the scene like with clients? I definitely have some for the UK, so I can add those afterwards.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Jens. So we can say that there are good points, opportunities, risks, and as you said previously, also as we said previously, some impacts. So what we can notice actually, notably in France, we have few difficulties to implement some of the recent French regulations, such as you know, maybe the zero artificialisation net, because as community interest programs are in progress or still coming, and developers are very interested in making them succeed. That's why a draft law has been proposed by the Senate majority to relax the zero artificialization net targets finally. So it's one of the difficulties we can evoke. Then in the other end, we can say that other regulations, such as the French ones and the European directive, lead to new great opportunities to make new efforts by companies. It makes also companies really more aware and push the standards. As I said previously, we can notice that from our clients. More and more ask us to implement new biodiversity carbon strategies, and it's really pushing the standards to a better level than the regulation. And it also, we can say, it also include supply chain responsibility. So it go further than the previous initiatives, going mostly on the site problematic. So it's a really good thing. And also at a scientific level, we can say that for Europe, we notice a consolidation of scientific knowledge and biodiversity indicators to evaluate these new efforts on biodiversity field, with the consideration again on sites and supply chain. So which is a very good thing. And we see also the providers going on this subject, on these targets, by going through for example, the LCA biodiversity, and so it's a very good point.
Yeah, that's very interesting to hear that people are kind of voluntarily already exceeding the regulatory side. It's quite encouraging. I think that also seems to be the case in the UK, especially with this TNFD, because in the UK there is nothing like the CSRD right now, but there seems to be growing adoption for people voluntarily disclosing the other parts of biodiversity impacts. And I think, I think it's the idea that once something starts to receive like 30% adoption in an industry, then it forces everyone to adopt. Otherwise, you're kind of left behind. So even if the regulations don't apply to you, it seems to be forcing people. But yeah, I guess just from my side, a small note about the future. In the UK, like UK BNG has been mandatory in England for 12 months now. It's, I would say, not been a completely smooth sailing from what it looks like. But generally, like, I think it was quite ambitious, and I think it's working well overall. But yeah, always met with some challenge. And it also seems to be likely to come into effect in Scotland in the future. They have already consulted on this and have commissioned adapting the biodiversity metric to be used in Scotland. So that's quite encouraging. And a very small thing, but I'm quite hopeful that it will happen, is that the TNFD has been discussed in the House of Parliament in the UK to hopefully in the future have something like a UK CSRD that's tackling these wider biodiversity impacts than BNG is. So quite hopeful for the future that there'll be a more aligned like policy that's used in different countries if CSRD and TNFD is successful. Yeah, so I guess now we can talk a little bit about the tool, and then Alejandro will jump into a case study from Jian's side where they've used the tool. So this is our biodiversity supply chain stress tool. The idea of this is to get an estimate of biodiversity impact based on a life cycle assessment. And as we've kind of covered at the start, like biodiversity itself is very complicated, and also the interactions with biodiversity are quite complicated, and there's many layers to it. So there are challenges with having one metric, or even 5 metrics would be a challenge, but this is like a tool that can start a conversation and kind of show you hotspots and where you should focus attention, because one of the main challenges for people to assess and manage their biodiversity risk is like where to start, and feeling like you need to do everything straight away. So there's definitely a prioritization aspect to this. But in short, the tool works like a life cycle impact assessment, so it's an extension on a regular LCA. And this is essentially applying an additional characterization factor to your LCA results. So for a given quantity of an emission or a pollutant, so CO2 equivalent, if this much CO2 equivalent is released in this location, how might that affect biodiversity? And it works by, well, it considers 10 impact indicators within the categories of climate change, pollution, and resource use. And this tool does not consider land use or land use change, nor invasive species. At the time of recording, I still don't think there is a realistic way to measure land use change based on a life cycle assessment, to my knowledge. And yeah, invasive species is also very challenging to consistently measure. It's more of like a case-by-case investigation. So yeah, we've addressed the impacts that are reasonably robust from a life cycle assessment. And last point is the tool uses a methodology called potentially disappeared fraction of species, which is a big mouthful, but you can shorten that to PDF meter squared. And the name is a little bit confusing because it's not really telling you about the number of species that might be extinct, but what it's actually measuring is the area in meters squared where in a period of 1 year all biodiversity might be lost. And the reason it's done like this is because these 10 impact indicators that we're looking at all have different geographical ranges, and they all have different time ranges as well. So something like a pollutant entering a river might have a short impact time range of like 10 years, and then the river might recover. Whereas something like marine acidification could have like an impact that occurs over hundreds of years. So normalizing the impacts into one area in 1 year, if we imagine they all happen at the same time, allows you to consider all of these impacts together, so that you have one number or like one KPI. And you could have this for a whole project or a single product as well. So it makes it easier to compare things if you aggregate and normalize all the results together. But yeah, I think that's high level how the tool works. So maybe Alejandro, if you wanted to talk about the case study.
Yes, of course. So, as I said earlier, we used to realize LCA assessments of buildings. So, even though the LCA is a multi-criteria method, some impacts are not necessarily included in this approach and still need to be evaluated, like biodiversity footprint. So, normally, the biodiversity footprint measures the impact of human activities on biodiversity. As James said earlier, normally we have 5 drivers of biodiversity loss, which are land use change, pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, resource exploitation, and invasive species. Normally, at GEON, for now, we measure the impact of the construction or renovation projects on biodiversity, but we only focus on three drivers. The three drivers that you can see in the middle of the picture here in the slide. Normally, they are greenhouse gas emissions, pollution, and resource exploitations. They are actually the only ones that the one-click tool can measure. Normally, this is one project that we had at GEON company, where the objective was to study the biodiversity footprint of the project to build a warehouse. So this was a real project who is subject to the RE 2020. This is the latest French environmental regulation for new buildings, implemented to reduce the carbon footprint of construction and to promote energy efficiency. So since the project is subject to the RE regulation, we are obligated to carry out a life cycle analysis. So once we carry out the LCA on RE 2020, it was very easy to make a direct transcription between the building LCA to the LCA supply chain stress tool. So we can literally in one click pass from one tool to another. So it was very easy to recover the data. So we can obtain a complete inventory of the materials necessary for the construction. Maybe it's important to mention that for this analysis, the implementation phase for the construction site and the part related to the operation of the building, like energy consumption and water consumption are not part of the scope of the study. Only the materials that we used and their impacts on their entire life, like manufacturing, maintenance, renewal, and end of life, were taken into account. So here you have a small description of this building. We have normally two buildings, one oriented for office use, another one for warehouse use. So you have the typical structure and fabric materials like timber. For external walls, we have timber from well. Windows, they are aluminum framed windows, and for upper floors, we have corrugated galvanized steel sheets plus timber frame for the structure. These are the results that we have for this assessment. As James mentioned before, the result of the biodiversity LCA shows the cumulative stress on biodiversity caused by the supply chain. We express the results in PDF per square meter per year. As you can see on the results of the table, the impact of the warehouse building on biodiversity is much greater than the offices building. We obtain more or less 79,000 PDF square meter per year. And for the building office, we obtain like a 4,000 PDF per square meter. But we can immediately notice that this raw indicator is probably difficult to grasp. So that we do, it was like if we divide the impact of the biodiversity by the surface of each building, we can have like another indicator that it could be maybe more familiar for everyone. So we can see in the last line, the PDF surface of each building. We have, for example, for warehouse, 1.87 PDF per square meter that we built. And for the office, it's 2.65. So we can see immediately that the office building is has more impact on in the biodiversity. It's because obviously you have more materials and more products to build this kind of building, even if the use is different for the warehouse, or even if this building is smaller than the warehouse building. So on the graphs, as you can see, the distribution of the impact on biodiversity is represented for the warehouse and the office building in the same way. So we notice a majority impact from the construction phase from A1 to A3, as you can see in both the graphs, and on the pressure of the climate change. so we can easily see where the impacts are coming from. In this slide, we can see the distribution of the different materials and products that, on the two LCA assessments that we realized for this project. The first one is related to the RE 2020, and the second one is related to the biodiversity loss. So we can easily see and appreciate that the most contribution materials were not the same on the biodiversity footprint, such as roofing or concrete for piles. So we can easily conclude that each product has an impact, but different impact. So when we build or when we renew a building, we need to think always in multi-criteria terms and not just focus on one or two indicators.
Cool. Thanks, Alejandro. Yeah, I just wanted to wrap up the case study by highlighting the point that Alejandro made, where we compared the actual total impact against the surface area, because this is really, really useful when you're comparing different projects to actually not just compare the net biodiversity impact, but if you make it relative to for example, the gross floor area or the number of floors or something like that in the building, because intuitively the warehouse impact was like 10 times higher because of the size, but a warehouse is kind of like a shell, I guess. In most cases it's quite a simple construction, whereas the office building, despite being really, really small, actually had like a relatively bigger impact on biodiversity because of the complexity of all the different materials inside. So actually, even though intuitively you want to reduce the impact of the warehouse because it was so big, it's probably more possible to reduce the impact from the office building by selecting some different materials, just because there are more materials in there. Whereas it might be difficult to use different types of materials on a warehouse building.
So much, Clement and James, for the very interesting discussion today. It was very insightful. Finally, we are always happy to hear from you. If you'd like to connect OneClick LCA, please visit our website at oneclicklca.com. That's all for now, and thank you again, and see you next time.
See you. Thank you very much.